When we last discussed Ehrensvärd, we covered his efforts in the 1920s, debating military policy and forging connections within both the military and political spheres. During the early 1930s, Ehrensvärd had various staff positions and served as a teacher at the Royal Swedish Army Staff College. Then, in 1937, a major reorganization of military leadership took place in Sweden, in which the separate staff organizations of the different military branches were merged into a unified defense staff. To understand why this was necessary, we need to examine Sweden's constitutional framework at the time. Constitutionally, the king was commander-in-chief of the army and navy. However, in practice, the king no longer exercised nor wished to exercise this authority. This created a leadership vacuum within the armed forces. To address this, a new position of Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces was established to centralize military authority. Initially, this role was intended only for wartime, but by the 1940s, it had expanded to cover both peace and wartime duties. The first person appointed to this role was General Olof Törnell, who faced significant criticism at the time for his alleged pro-German views. When the defense staff was created in 1937, Ehrensvärd was appointed Chief of the Army Operations Department, while his close associate, Helge Ljung, became Army Chief of Staff. By this time, the general political sentiment in Sweden had shifted from a peacetime mindset to the recognition that the military needed greater funding and modernization. The Defense Act of 1936 increased the military budget from 180 million SEK to 148 million, which was about 1.5% of GDP. The primary beneficiary of this increase was the Air Force, whose funding rose from 11 million to 28 million SEK. This act also laid the groundwork for a national defense industry to support the Air Force's requirements. However, the new Supreme Commander, Olof Törnell, had a strained relationship with the army leadership. He was accused of favoring the Air Force and the Navy, which received the majority of the new funding. This deeply concerned Ehrensvärd, who believed these priorities undermined the army's offensive capabilities. By 1939, Sweden's wartime army numbered 200,000 men. The late realization of Europe's escalating tensions left Sweden far less prepared for war than it had been in 1914. One significant weakness identified by the army and by Ehrensvärd was the lack of modern tanks and expertise to use them effectively in large-scale formations. At the time, Swedish industry could not produce tanks that were competitive internationally. As the Army Chief of Operations Department, Ehrensvärd led a procurement of new tanks. To address the tank issue, Ehrensvärd explored purchasing tanks from Czechoslovak Republic, whose industry already had tanks in serial production. During a visit to inspect the facilities, Ehrensvärd made the decision to purchase cheaper tanks armed with machine guns in larger quantities rather than investing in a small number of more advanced models equipped with cannons. The approach of more but lesser allowed for tactical training in battalion-sized units, even if it limited Sweden's firepower. It would take until 1944 before the Swedish industry had the capacity to produce tanks equipped with 75mm cannons, a critical shortfall during the war's early years. From 1938 to 1939, now Lieutenant Colonel Ehrensvärd focused on developing tank tactics while commanding the tank battalion at Skaraborg Regiment. On the 26th of August 1939, just days before the German invasion of Poland, Sweden officially enacted a policy of enhanced defense readiness, a policy which then would stand throughout the war. By December of that year, Ehrensvärd's friend, Axel Rappe, had been appointed interim Chief of Defense Staff, when General Törnell officially became the Supreme Commander. When the Soviets invaded Finland on the 30th of November, Rappe argued strongly for a Swedish intervention in the war. He went as far as drawing up plans for such action. The Swedish government, which was by now made up of a grand coalition of most of the parties in parliament, did agree to provide Finland with substantial military aid and to let Swedish volunteers join the Finnish war effort. The government also did change Sweden's official status from neutral to non-belligerent, but they did not want to go as far as Rappe suggested. Instead, Rappe was reassigned to a new role as inspector of the artillery. The Swedish military aid was relatively significant though. Among other things, 100 air defense artillery pieces were sent, 135,000 rifles and machine guns, 144 artillery pieces, 100 anti-tank guns, Overall, the equipment sent meant an entire division that was planned to be raised in 1940 was delayed. Up to a third of the Swedish Air Force was also sent, with Swedish pilots and ground crews manning the aircrafts. Also, mostly Italian planes were bought by Finland and transported to Sweden, where they were assembled, tested and then sent to Finland. But even if the Swedish government refused to get into the war, its acceptance of Swedish volunteers meant that a significant volunteer corps could be organized and funded through civilian and industry contributions. The corps, which would amount to over 9,000 Swedish personnel at the end of the Winter War, was equipped from Swedish military stock and led by Swedish officers. One of those officers would of course be Carl August Ehrensvärd, who chose to return to serve Finland, just as he had done during the Finnish Civil War. This time he was appointed as the Chief of Staff of the entire volunteer corps, which meant he led the corps together with its commander, Lieutenant General Ernst Linde. Less than a month after the outbreak of the war, the first part of the Swedish Volunteer Corps shipped over to Finland. Ehrensvärd and General Linde arrived on the 7th of January. A month later, the first of 3 battle groups were fully operational, and by the end of February, the second battle group also became operational. The Volunteer Corps could now take over defensive duties in Finnish Lapland and free up 5 battalions of experienced Finnish soldiers, who were sent to defend Viborg. All in all, the Corps would take less than 100 casualties, while together with some Finnish units, being able to fix 2 entire Soviet divisions on their part of the front. Praise for the Swedish support effort for Finland came even from Hitler, whose phone calls were picked up by Swedish intelligence on some occasions when they traveled through Swedish phone lines. During the Winter War, the Swedish army had organized an entire corps for the defense of the north and had concentrated it towards Finland, in case the Soviets would break through. The threat of an invasion from the west was deemed too unrealistic at the time, a judgment that would soon prove problematic. In total, between 100,000 and 150,000 Swedish soldiers were mobilized during the Winter War. After the peace was signed, Finnish Marshal Mannerheim held a speech to the Swedish Volunteer Corps where he praised their conduct and the aid from Sweden. He also promoted Ehrensvärd to the rank of colonel in the Finnish army. During the rest of March and the beginning of April, Ehrensvärd worked on demobilizing and sending the Swedish volunteers home. He and his staff were in the middle of this work on the 9th of April when somebody turned on the radio in the headquarters to hear the news that Denmark had fallen and that German troops had entered Norway. In his memoirs, Ehrensvärd writes that one of their first thoughts were that they hoped the Swedish government had started the mobilization in time. And in fact, intelligence had reached Sweden about a week prior that an invasion could be happening. Historian Lars Eriksson Folke describes the moment in an article in the May 2023 edition of the magazine Populär Historia. At the beginning of April, it became entirely clear to the Swedish defense staff that troops and ships had been concentrated in several German port cities. But for what purpose? At the same time, there was concern that the Western Allies might attempt to forcibly halt Sweden's iron ore exports to Germany via Narvik. On Thursday, April 4th, Naval Attaché Anders Forsell raised the alarm from Berlin, reporting that he had received credible information about German plans to next week occupy Denmark and possibly also Norway. Forsell assumed that Sweden would not be attacked, as the Germans would not want to risk the destruction of the iron ore mines, which were so vital for them. Because of this, the Supreme Commander wanted to start some preparation for a general mobilization. But this was never approved by the government, beyond starting the activation of another army corps headquarters in the south. The reason was mainly that the government did not want to provoke the Germans. Instead, on the 9th of April, the situation was actually the reverse. The 2nd Army Corps, that had mobilized towards the Finnish border in the north, was in a demobilization phase, and overall, in the whole country there were only about 70,000 active servicemen available. That same day, Ehrensvärd received orders to immediately report to his friend Axel Rappe in the defense staff. He was also to report to the in December newly appointed first Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, General Törnell, the same man who had a reputation of being friendly to the Germans. When he arrived in Stockholm, Ehrensvärd was told that he was to become the Chief of Staff for the entire 2nd Army Corps, the same corps that was stationed in the north guarding towards Finland, but now had to, as hastily as possible, be moved southwest towards the border with Norway. Ehrensvärd was reluctant to take on his new position. Normally, the Chief of Staff of an entire corps held the rank of Major General, and he was still only a Lieutenant Colonel in the Swedish Army. He and the new commander of the corps, General Nygren, also had some personal issues in the past that made Ehrensvärd hesitate, but Rappe insisted that this was for the best, and the situation demanded that normal military formality was put aside. He also informed Ehrensvärd that his cousin, Archibald Douglas, who had been the previous Chief of Staff for the Second Corps, would take command of the remaining forces in the north. Ehrensvärd was then sent in to see the Supreme Commander. In his book, Krigsfall Sverige, Jan Linder quotes Ehrensvärd's memoirs in telling what happened next. General Törnell said roughly the same as Rappe. At the time, I was still a Finnish officer and asked somewhat cheekily whether the intention was for us to fight or to behave like the Danes. Törnell squinted at me and said, "We will fight if the Germans attack. Do you want that in writing?" I replied that the Supreme Commander's word was enough. We laughed, after which I reiterated my concerns about my placement. But to no avail. The Supreme Commander briefed General Nygren about his new assignment and informed him that I would be his Chief of Staff. An officer who was present later recounted that Nygren commented on the telegram with the words, "An interesting assignment. Ehrensvärd as Chief of Staff. I would never have chosen him myself, but it will probably work out." He was proven right. The work on mobilizing the army and moving its units into position for the new strategic reality was now the main focus. The first larger units to mobilize were in the south, with a cavalry brigade as a rapid reaction force centered in the middle of Scania, ready to counterattack a possible landing. The fleet had been mobilized already before the German invasions, and the Gothenburg Naval Squadron had sailed out already on the 8th. The first Swedish units to reach positions on the border with Norway came on the 13th of April. Within 2 weeks, the majority of the mobilization had been completed. About a month later, in early May, the Swedish Army had mobilized a force of 320,000 men, the largest active force it has ever had under arms at the same time. Some defensive lines had begun to be built even before the start of the war, such as the Per Albin line that defended the western and southern coast of Scania. But the work that now began would result in substantial defensive fortifications. The book, Svenska Arméns Historia, about the history of the Swedish Army, details the constructions that were now done. The defense and fortification lines were expanded on a large scale between 1939 and 1945. For the Army, this included 2,356 concrete gun emplacements, 1,384 anti-tank obstacles, 1,249 shelters, 93 anti-aircraft command centers, and 205 fortifications for airfield defense. Vulnerable coastal areas were equipped with fortifications for combat against both sea and land threats. Along the national borders, fortifications were constructed at key points of entry, while airfields were reinforced with combat emplacements, shelters, and additional anti-aircraft command centers. On the 14th of April, the first of General Nygren's and Ehrensvärd's units, the Bohus Regiment, reached the border with Norway. By the end of the month, the pair had managed, by moving units from north and east, to assemble the entire 2nd Army Corps at its area of operation in western Sweden, towards the Norwegian border. This meant that Nygren and Ehrensvärd had managed to complete the redeployment before the Germans had even reached the border. For Ehrensvärd, it was now an issue of getting a materially inferior force to be competitive with a highly successful and highly motivated German army. But morale among the Swedish mobilized troops were very high, and many of the men arrived at their post even before their mobilization date. After some scouting of the area, Ehrensvärd settled on a place outside of Vara in Västergötland County, just south of the large lake Vänern, for the Army Corps headquarters. Ehrensvärd now put a lot of effort into creating an agile and flexible force that would be quick in reacting to any German movements. He issued instructions for how to effectively give orders quickly. Acting fast was a mantra for Ehrensvärd and something he wanted his staff to be good at. They also developed plans for attacking first, by crossing into Norway with light Jäger units before a suspected German attack. Being materially inferior meant they had to be creative, but using mobilized troops also meant having a large group of people with a diverse range of skills from civilian life, something that now came in very handy when they were building defensive positions. Jan Linder, in the book Krigsfall Sverige, describes the force Ehrensvärd put together by quoting the military archivist B.G. Sexén, who traveled through the area at the time. We began to approach the border. Roadblocks became more numerous, and the checks increasingly strict. They were no longer satisfied with our identification documents. When we reached the foremost border company, a great sense of seriousness prevailed. All traffic stopped there. Something special was in the air, and fingers were kept on the trigger. Sexén goes on to describe his visit to the foremost outpost. Its task was to trigger explosions along a long rock wall to block the road in the event of a German attack. The soldiers had been offered relief a few days earlier, but requested to stay. They preferred to defend the position. They had prepared themselves, as they knew the terrain and its possibilities best, and they had forged a close camaraderie, free of weak links. This was not an isolated case. On the contrary, the same could be observed throughout the front lines. The book, Svenska arméns historia, compares Sweden's position at the time with its Nordic neighbors. Compared to Denmark and Norway, the Swedish military in 1940 was significantly stronger. Structurally, it closely resembled the Finnish forces, with large army units intended primarily for deployment in forested terrain to hinder the enemy in the event of a war. In open terrain duels against a great power, Sweden was clearly at a disadvantage. However, in favorable tactical situations, it could counterattack with surprising effectiveness. Defending one's own homeland with intimate knowledge of the terrain suited for delaying actions provides many advantages. With the German invasion of the Benelux and in France in May, the pressure on the Swedish forces was lessened, and after the end of the Norwegian campaign in early June, the situation at the border had stabilized. Even though it was never tested, Ehrensvärd's organizing and hard work, with all likelihood, had made the Second Army Corps into a very difficult adversary for any German intrusion. His work had also put him on the road towards higher commands, which in 1942 would lead him to one of the key posts in the army. But that is something we'll have to talk about in episode 3.